If you're a fan of award-winning books and of rankings, then today's video just might be for you. Today, I will be ranking all 18 Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners from the 2024 awards. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at all 18 of the books that were in the Pulitzer Prize book categories. But just so you know, there are 6 book categories, more or less. I'd say one of those is maybe a little more debatable. You have one fiction category, so any fiction falls within that category. You then have 4 nonfiction categories, and then one that's somewhere in between. That one would be poetry, and so that is probably the slightly more questionable one, but it's also generally pretty short, and I enjoy reading those. So I'm going to include that in this book category. You also have your general nonfiction. You have your history, you have your biography, and you have your autobiography / memoir. This is actually only the second year that autobiography / memoir has been its own category. And I will tell you now, I don't love that category usually. I struggle with memoirs, that's just me personally, so I'll let you know now, in my rankings, they are probably going to take a little bit of a hit. Although not all of them, and I did not dislike them equally, and I will explain that in my rankings. Now, I'm going to just go ahead and rank all 18 of them. I had a couple different ways that I thought about approaching this, and I just realized that each of the other ways just didn't quite fit. First of all, I thought about saying, well, what books would I choose to fill each of these categories? And I realized that in some of these categories, I just don't read enough of these types of books. As many books as I read in a year, I still have not read enough memoir or autobiographies to really put in any other books in this section because I just don't. Or I could look at the ones that have already been selected as the winner and the finalist and decide which one would I have actually made of those 3 to be the winner. I also decided that that really just wasn't all that interesting, and really what I'd like to do is acknowledge that I have read all 18 of these books, and I just want to take them and rank them to give you an idea what I think of what would probably be considered, at least by a very literary crowd, considering that these are Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners, what the group of smarty pants people off in New York or wherever that put this together, what books they thought should be considered for these awards. And I'll let you know, after having read all 18 of them, how I would rank them. So here is my list of the books ranked from 18 to number 1. We're of course going to start with 18 because I got to work my way to my favorite one. And just to be clear, I think every single one of these had some merit. I didn't read a single one of these and come away thinking, oh my gosh, that was an awful book, I don't know how it got nominated. They are all at least well written. Now, that being said, I still certainly have some problems with some of them, but I did still enjoy them to a degree, and I'll try to identify what things I did like and didn't like about each of the works, and I will let you know why they go where they do on my rankings. Now, how did I rank them? It's pretty straightforward. I took each of the categories, and within each category, I decided, well, of those 3 books, how would I have ranked them? And then I just started matching each book up against all the others, and I said, and you know, in my list I said, did I enjoy this one more or less than the book above it? If I enjoyed it more, then I would put it above it, and then do that until I no longer had a book that I enjoyed more than it, and I felt like that put it in an appropriate ranked spot in my list. With that being said, let's get started. Coming in at number 18 is A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy by Nathan Thrall. Interesting enough, this is actually my video that has gotten the most views on YouTube, and it's also gotten the most hatred on YouTube because it's just a highly polarizing topic. Obviously, with the war right now going on in Israel and in Gaza, and of course all the other conflicts that are now spurting up around Israel, in part because of the conflict in Gaza, there has been a lot that has been said about this ongoing issue. Now, this book does not actually deal directly with that, but it is going to at least be related to it, and I think for that reason there are certainly a lot of people that have strong opinions about this topic. I think that's why it's gotten so many views. The reason I'm putting it so low on my list is it has nothing to do with my opinions on Israel or Palestine or any of that. My reason is I just didn't find the book or the main character to be particularly likable. And I felt like that was a key part of understanding the significance of this whole book. On top of that, I did feel like there were some elements of it that just were not well enough written, that I either didn't understand the purpose of them or I didn't understand the main purpose of the book. And so that was my big problem with the book. I didn't hate it, I just certainly came away with a lot of questions about the way it was written and the way it was presented. And I swear that is my opinion. It has nothing to do with the actual ongoing conflict or the long-standing issues between the Israelis and the Palestinians or anything along those lines. I promise that it has nothing to do with why I put this book so low. I just didn't think it was a particularly well-written book, in my opinion. Number 17 is The Best Minds, A Story of Friendship, Madness, and the Tragedy of Good Intention by Jonathan Rosin. Now, I've been on record of saying this before. I'm already suspicious of any autobiography or memoir. I really don't think it should have its own category. By and large, I don't think they are all that well written. I generally find that they're just a little too self-serving, and don't get me wrong, I've read many great memoirs that I generally like. My problem in this case is not that I don't like memoirs straight up, although sometimes I do have my issues with them. It's that I feel like this intersection of memoirs plus very literary books tends to be just a little harder for me to appreciate, especially since very frequently, and this is a great example of it, the justification for why it was written and the justification for why it's considered a memoir and autobiography don't always match up, in my opinion. This being a great example of it, because Jonathan Rosin is actually an accomplished author in his own right. He wrote a book that was, a memoir told about his life growing up, but more importantly, it was trying to tell the story of an individual who was very important for expanding the public discussion and debate about mental illness. The problem is that story had its own storyline. And I felt like Jonathan Rosin wrote this book just to insert himself into something that was bigger than himself, and I didn't think that it was particularly well done. I felt like he was jumping back and forth a little too much. I think that Rosin in and of himself is an interesting person, and I certainly think that there could have been more things about his life that he could have focused on. This is someone that made a decision to go into writing after having a relatively interesting life, I think, up to that point. And I thought that that was enough to be engaging. And so if he wanted to write about this individual that was kind of a childhood friend, well, I shouldn't say kind of, he was certainly a childhood friend. The issue is that they stopped being friends really when they went off to college. And so it's at that point of their divergence in their lives that it kind of becomes hard to really justify this as a memoir anymore. And his connection to the main character and the purpose for writing this book suddenly become a lot harder to justify. And I found that just a little problematic for this book, especially for how long it was. It was way too long for a book that just didn't say enough important things. And I felt like it had two different missions that it needed to pick one or the other. And I think, again, that's one of my main problems with memoirs. It's either going to be incredibly self-serving about yourself, or if you're trying to write about something that is not you specifically, it is you then inserting yourself in something that you were not the primary figure. And so this is going to be an ongoing problem with memoirs and autobiographies for me, especially ones that are going to be considered for the Pulitzer Prizes. I love to hear what someone's experience was when it came to something. I've read several political memoirs this year, and even though they're obviously going to be very deliberate in what they say, I certainly appreciate having the person that was at the center of any kind of event telling me what happened. In this case, it's having someone on the periphery that I feel like is trying to say they were a little more involved than they actually were. That's my problem with this book. At number 16, we have Wednesday's Child, Yi Yun Lee. Now, let me start by saying I really enjoyed all of the fiction books from last year, and I didn't like any of the fiction books from this year. I'm actually surprised that I don't have all three of them lower on this list. There was things that I enjoy about them. They're fiction, which means that you have more liberty to just make it a more fascinating story. I think all of these books have at least some value in the prose that are in them, and I certainly would say that about Wednesday's Child as well. The problem with Wednesday's Child to me is a few things. First of all, it's not one storyline. It's a bunch of different stories, and I did not connect with most of them. One of the main themes that I saw as I read a bunch of these books was that there were a lot of questions about identity, especially Asian American identity. This is certainly one of those books. However, I felt like other books talked about it in a much more meaningful and a much easier to understand way. Is that because I'm not Asian American? Possibly, and that's always something worth considering, but I just did not come away from Wednesday's Child feeling all that more interested in reading anything else by the author, unfortunately. And so hopefully I can get better feedback and someone can recommend a different book by this author, but otherwise I just didn't particularly care for this book, even though it was one of the few fictions, and so I probably wouldn't even have included it as a finalist, let alone it would not be my winner in that category. At 15 is 22040 by Jory Graham. It was a collection of poems. I enjoyed all of the collections of poetry this year. It just, as I was ranking it and comparing it to other books, I just put it a little lower. I felt like it was a little too contrived. The reference to 2040 is this idea of our vanishing nature as we deal with global climate change, and that was the premise of it. And I certainly enjoyed some of the poems in it, but then there were some that were just a little too obtuse for me, or just a little too hard for me to appreciate, and I didn't quite enjoy the actual poetry as much as the other two collections of poems within all of these books. At number 14, we have Liliana's Invincible Summer, A Sister Search for Justice. This is another one of the autobiographies. This is by Cristina Rivera Garza, and I must say, Cristina Rivera Garza's first language, I believe, is Spanish, but my goodness, her prose is so good, and I actually really enjoyed that about this book. However, I did not care all that much for the storyline. And it's touching upon a really important topic of partner abuse, of domestic abuse, and I certainly thought that that category was really important. The problem with this book is it doesn't actually really dive into that. Because it's an autobiography, because it's a memoir, the whole point is to get the perspective of the author, right? And since she is not the one that was actually in the abusive relationship, and at the time she was incapable of even really understanding what was going on in the relationship, it makes it really hard for her to write about it in what I thought to be a meaningful way. So I felt like there was actually a lot of parts where she was just kind of making conjectures, and I thought that she was just doing a little too much with what she was trying to say the purpose of this book was. However, what she did do incredibly well was write very well and engage with questions of independence, which is part of the title. Liliana's Invincible Summer is a reference to her creating her own independence. The problem is, at the real backdrop of all that is this question of domestic and partner abuse. And I felt like because that was such an important part of the story, it really undermined much of what Cristina Rivera Garza was trying to do. And again, since she is so incredibly smart and capable. Which brings us to number 13, No Rights to an Honest Living by Jacqueline Jones. This is in the category of history, and it is actually the winner. I enjoyed this book. It was a look at the working conditions in the Boston area right around the Civil War and just after the Civil War, and it dealt with a lot of challenging questions, especially when it came to a moment that is generally considered an incredibly important moment in American history for freedom, the emancipation, but it also took a look at the struggles of even after emancipation, or in an area that had long since abolished slavery. It was still very much a question of class and opportunities, and it was a really interesting look into it. However, it did look at a pretty narrow scope, and sometimes I can enjoy that, but in this case, I don't know why. I wish I'd been able to see it more from a macro perspective, as well as this really focused look in Boston. And I think that that would have served it just a little bit better, and it probably would have made it a little more interesting for me to read. I certainly found the people that were discussed in it to be very interesting subjects to cover by Jacqueline Jones, but on the other hand, I also had a hard time fully appreciating just how indicative that was of the larger American experience, and so that was just something that I thought that could have used a little more, that would have made it just a slightly better read. However, it is an excellent piece of archival work, and it does a great job at really digging into sources in a way that I think might be singular to all of the other books. I'd have to finish looking at my list, but I thought the archival work done on this was phenomenal, and I did appreciate that. But that doesn't always translate to something that I love to read in quite the same way. So that would be one reason why this didn't make it super high on my list, but I certainly still considered it a good read. Which brings us to number 12, Same Bed, Different Dreams by Ed Park. This was one of the few fiction books. I have to say that I enjoyed some elements of this book a lot. It's very experimental, similar to a lot of the books in this year. It deals with identity, in this case, of course, with Korean identity, and it has an element of rewriting history, and it tells history in an interesting way. And there's a lot going on in this book that I really enjoyed. The only reason I actually marked this down, it wasn't even because it was experimental or because there were parts of it that I didn't care for. I only marked this down simply because it tells a lot of history that I know is accurate, but then it also inserted a lot of history that I wasn't so sure about. And that was just a bit of a struggle for me. I then went and looked at as much history as I could to see what parts of it I could verify and what parts I couldn't. And I don't always love that in a book. Whether it's a fiction or nonfiction, I don't love the need for me personally to do extra research if it wasn't something that just compelled me to do more research. In this case, it was because I just didn't have enough knowledge about this book to fully appreciate it. And I wish that I was just a little more sure of myself when I had read the book. But that being said, I absolutely enjoyed the experimental elements of it. And I also enjoyed the fact that it belongs with a lot of other books this year that dealt with questions of identity, and specifically Asian and Asian American identity. That was a big theme. But on top of that, there was just lots of questions of identity that you could be found throughout all of these books that I didn't see in last year's books in quite the same way. So I thought that was a recurring theme that I generally appreciated. Speaking of identity, that brings us to number 11, another one of the poetry books, Tripas by Brandon Som. Brandon Som has some Mexican-American ancestry. He also has some Chinese ancestry, and you actually see a good deal of that in this book. There's moments of that are written in Spanish, moments that are written in English, moments of it that have Chinese characters, which I couldn't read, but I actually really enjoyed that part of it because it, again, lent itself to the importance of identity and what we use to identify ourselves, including language, including our ability to even read what's in front of us. And he did go on to say what the symbols meant, but that wasn't entirely the point. The point was that I'm looking at something that I don't understand, and I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we consider the identity of individuals, especially as people are grappling with their own understanding of themselves. And I really enjoyed that about this book. I really enjoyed this book. I realized it's down at 11. It didn't even crack the top 10 for me because I generally enjoyed most of the Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners this year. And so I don't have a particularly negative thing to say about Tripas. I would certainly recommend it. It wasn't my favorite of the poetry books. We'll get to that one in a few, but it certainly was still something that I thoroughly enjoyed reading. At number 10, we have Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips, which was the winner of the fiction books. And it was the one that I enjoyed the most. However, you'll notice that it still is only at about 10. I'm not going to lie, this year I didn't love the fiction books the same way that I enjoyed last year's batch of fiction books. There were certainly things I enjoyed about them. I've already mentioned that. There's a lot of questions of identity, especially with the other two. And in this one, this was a gripping tale that really dealt with the end of the Civil War. And there's, again, some elements of experimental storytelling in this that I really enjoyed. And it just dealt with a fascinating place in West Virginia. It dealt with a sanatorium, a place of healing in a moment of recovery for the United States, and it actually was looking at an individual's life and their experience. And so I thought all that made this an interesting read. However, one of the problems I found in all three of the fiction books this year is that it kind of lacked a gripping element that kept it a page turner. I realize it's frequently not going to be a theme of books like this, but it also meant that I could walk away from it and come back pretty infrequently, and it took me a little while to finish it. And when I have a book like that, I generally hope that it's causing me to be reflective. I would certainly say that it could cause me to be reflective at times, but not enough for me to really consider this an incredibly thought-provoking book. And I'd say that's probably one of the reasons why it didn't quite make it higher on this list. I will say one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is that the writing and the quality of the prose is really well done. I thought that I constantly found myself just rethinking about a phrase they had written. It is set in a particular time period, which is always something that lends itself to a element of creativity as well as historicity that can be very challenging but can also be really rewarding, and it certainly had those elements in this book. But like I said, I also didn't come away thinking that was a railroad page turner or that I found myself really reflecting a lot. And I think when I'm missing both of those things in a book like this, then I just have a hard time ranking it super high. However, I would certainly still recommend this to individuals that are looking at the list from Pulitzer Prize books last year. At number 9, we have Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives by Sid Arth Kara. This won for nonfiction general. I really enjoyed certain elements of this book. I definitely found the premise fascinating. As we're looking into a future that is constantly changing and evolving, one thing that does seem to be constant is definitely the need for more technology and electronics, and that is the thing that this book is addressing, especially the need for batteries. As we're looking at all sorts of alternative forms of energy, batteries are definitely going to be a necessary part of that. But even if you're not interested in questions of alternative energy, you still are heavily reliant on batteries in your cell phone, in your laptop. Almost anything you deal with is going to require a battery. And so that brings us to the question of the minerals, in this case, of course, it's cobalt, that are necessary for creating batteries. And I thought this was a fascinating look into that. However, if you go and see my video about that, you will also know that I do have a little problem with this book, and that is that it's a little too focused on the author's experience. He goes to the Congo and he goes to small villages and he does see lots of interesting things and he sees a lot of tragic things and he has a lot to say about it, and I did enjoy that. However, I did feel, in a similar sense to some of the other books that I've reviewed, that he kind of lacked a really important macro element of it to help me better understand, well, what are the possible solutions going forward, or what are some of the ways in which the conditions can be improved by simply understanding not just the scope of the mining process, but the entirety of the supply chain that is necessary. And I would just like a little more about that. I realized that that's not always the intention of an author, but I did think that his personal experience became a little too much for me to fully enjoy it. I understand that individuals' experience are a big part of what they write about, but I felt like the title and the premise led me to believe that he would just have a little more information and a little more research to flesh out, and not just a personal experience. His personal experience was interesting to read, and he did certainly see lots of fascinating things, but I would still just have to add the caveat that I would have probably preferred that he was a little less a part of the subject, and that you saw more from other people. That's just my personal opinion, although if I were this individual and I had been to the Congo and seen the things that he had seen, I certainly would come away with a similar desire to tell this story from my perspective. And that's probably something that can be really hard for a journalist that did such deep research and did such important on-location research. And that's just something that I would like to have seen a little different. At number 8, we have Information Desk, an epic by Robin Schiff. This was my favorite collection of poetry this year. It actually won in the category of poetry. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. Again, you can go see my review about that to get more ideas about why I loved it. All 3 of the books of poetry had very provocative language that I really enjoyed, and they all touched upon completely different things. And this one was fascinating because it dealt with information desks and libraries and reference desks, which can just seem so tedious, yet the way it was written about was just, I loved it. I loved the language in this book. I don't read a ton of poetry. The ones that are nominated for Pulitzer Prizes are by and large what I will read each year, but I must say that I loved this book. I really enjoyed the language in it. I really enjoyed the presentation. It was actually one of the few books that the author read the audiobook for, which I just love hearing poetry in the voice of the author and hearing the way that they wanted it to be said. And I certainly recommend this. If anyone is looking for a collection of poems from this last year, this would be my first pick, and it was my favorite within that category, and I thought very much so that it deserved to win. At number 7 is American Anarchy by Michael Roach. This was actually the last book that I read. I really enjoyed it. It was one of the few books that there was not an audiobook, and so I had to actually read it. It wasn't too terribly long. It did deal with an interesting moment in American history that I've always been intrigued by, and I also thought that it was a fascinating look at the balance between this desire for individual rights as well as the state's need for protection and security. I thought it was a great look at that, and I really enjoyed all of those elements. I also really appreciated how much it dug into the importance of immigration into the developing of political ideologies in the late 19th and early 20th century, not just in America, but all over the world. When we think about political movements, they're really, by and large, especially as we consider in large political parties or just large mass movement, that is a relatively new concept. It is really only about 150 years old or so. And so I think it's really important to tap into one that I think history has not looked down kindly upon. And I think there's justifiable reasons for that. I think a lot of the deaths associated with the anarchist movement of the early 20th century could certainly explain why there is not a real sympathetic view of the anarchist movement. But I also think it's important to understand why it did have some popularity and why it was perceived as such a threat. And I think that there's this notion that, well, anarchists say we shouldn't have government. Obviously, it's a threat. But I thought this book did a pretty good job at giving you a lot more context and understanding why that would be an appealing movement and explaining a little bit more about that movement. However, I thought it just needed a slightly better balance, because this book suggests that you're talking about this large political movement, well, a notable political movement. However, the focus is on a few individuals and their court cases, and so I think I would have done one or the other. I would have made it clear that this was primarily about those court cases, or I would have downplayed those a little more and tried to give a little more broader information. Regardless, I thought it was an interesting read, and I think anyone that is curious about any of the major political movements in the early 20th century. I think that you would find this interesting. It was not the biggest political movement, but it certainly had very important consequences. As you can see, it resulted in the death of several world leaders, including an American president. And there's a lot that you could unwrap there. If you're not familiar with this time period at all, or you just want to know more about political history or a little bit more about political violence, I think in this past year that became a recurring theme. And so I think that all of that could make this an appealing book for someone that just wants to know a little bit more about American political history. At number 6 is Master, Slave, Husband, Wife by Il Yan-Wu. This is one of the 2 winners in the biography category. You can have 2 winners and then you'll have an additional finalist. That is not super common. I think there were a couple last year, and in this year this was the only category that had 2 winners. This is a fascinating look at a couple, the Crafts, who escaped from slavery in 1848 from Georgia. It's one of the most interesting stories that I've read about individuals escaping from slavery, and it is certainly worth your time if you're not familiar with the story. I did have some familiarity with the story, but this certainly still added some context that I really enjoyed. On top of that, it takes an even broader look at the abolitionist movement and how individuals like this affected the abolitionist movement and what it was like once they escaped from slavery, because there is a lot of discussion of the challenges individuals faced and the obligations that they felt after they escaped from slavery. Did they want to go on a speaking tour? In some cases that was a great way to make some money. In some cases it just exposed them even more so. Once we had the passing of the fugitive slave laws, that made it harder for individuals to not only go on tour, but it could even make it difficult to live in their own cities, because especially if they'd published the fact that they were an escaped slave and they had talked about how they'd escaped slavery, which was a whole nother question, because there was a lot of debate about at the time about publishing or letting it be known how you escaped from slavery, because some people would try to copy it to success and some people would try to copy it to their detriment. And so I mean, this really digs into a lot of questions, and it's not just their story, but it is telling a larger story as well about what it was like to escape slavery and what were some of the possible consequences. And I found it an absolutely interesting read. I will say it is considered a biography because they are at the center of the story, but they are probably only about 2/3 of the totality of this book. At least 1/3 of it is focusing on the larger picture, and their escape from slavery happens relatively early on within the book. I think by halfway through you're already escaped from slavery. So on the one hand that could seem anticlimactic, but I think that should also help you better understand the totality of this book so that you can understand that the second half of it is dealing with the consequences of escaping from slavery, which I think is an incredibly important part to consider when you think of slavery and the complexities of not just escaping from slavery, but then trying to establish your life in the North. All of that makes for a fascinating read, a compelling read, and certainly something that I think could help anyone appreciate life in America before the Civil War much better. And I would recommend that to almost anyone. At number 5, we have Fireweather, A True Story from a Hotter World by John Vaillant. I actually really enjoyed this book so much that I went back and read almost all of John Vaillant's books. I was not familiar with his work. I really enjoyed all of them that I read. I do think this was his best book, and I actually think that this should have won for general nonfiction. I enjoyed the other general nonfiction books, but this was my favorite of the 3, and I wish this one had won. It first of all was incredibly well written. John Vaillant is an excellent author. Second of all, his approach is just so compelling. What he does is he takes an event, and in this case, he takes a look at a fire that happened in a small community in Canada, and he details everything about the fire. He details the preparations for it, or lack thereof. He details what happened once the fire started and everyone's reaction to it. It's a relatively small town, so he's able to weave in a whole lot of narratives to tell you what exactly is going on. And of course, he talks about the consequences. And obviously, the reason he is telling this story is because of the consequences of more severe fires that we have had in the last decade or so, and which are only going to get worse on top of climate change. There's all sorts of ecological reasons why we're having increased fire, and weather is drier in some places. He certainly talks about that, and that is one of the reasons why he writes the books that he does, but he puts so much detail into a single event that it is adding really important information, and in many cases context that you may not realize for the larger question of ecological impact that humans have, whether it be climate change or deforestation or any of that, are all questions to consider when you think about how humans interact with the world around them. I thought, first of all, he told this in such a compelling way, and I thought that he was dealing with a really important question in a way that just really pulled me in. Even if you have qualms with the discussion around climate change, whether you deny it, or you don't believe humans are a primary part of it, or you have some other question about what exactly the government involvement should be with it, whatever your issues might be, you could still certainly enjoy this book, because even though that's part of the reason why he wrote this book, I would still say that just the narrative that he draws will bring you in regardless of your beliefs around that. And he does that in all of his books. I've enjoyed all of them, and I certainly thought that this was a great example of his writing, and I would certainly recommend this book to anyone. At number 5, we have The Country of the Blind by Andrew Leland. I was surprised that I found an autobiography that I would put so high. I don't love autobiographies and memoirs. Even if every word you say in there is true, the inability to really fact check it, or the fact that you get to choose what is being said about your life, it just gives you a chance to create a narrative that I don't always trust, or even if I do trust it, I don't always buy into it. And so I don't love this category. And I'm actually surprised that it has its own category. That being said, I've gone back and looked at when autobiography and biography were one category. I think autobiography / memoir won way too often. I just do not like this category quite as much as apparently the literary type do. I was looking at the top 10 books from the New York Times from this past year, and I noticed that they had a couple memoirs and autobiographies in there. And I struggle with that. I just struggle with that. I think that I've certainly read essays that I really enjoy that tell an individual story from someone's life. And I've certainly read memoirs and autobiographies that I have enjoyed. I just frequently do not connect with autobiographies and memoirs the same way that others do, it appears, because the ones that people tend to suggest are not my favorites, and the ones that I tend to enjoy don't seem to get much literary acclaim. So that's my issue. That being said, I really enjoyed this. Andrew Leland is quite the author. I think that he was a pretty well-established author before he wrote this book. I haven't read any of his other stuff, but I've seen him pop up in places, and I actually heard a lot of what he talked about in this book. I heard him mention in a couple other podcasts, and that was one of the things that drew me to this. I found him individually to be an interesting character. I found the story that he was telling to inherently be interesting, that it didn't take any kind of fudging or finessing. I immediately found what he was trying to talk about very interesting. One of the problems I have with most memoirs and autobiographies is it's an individual convincing you that their story is fascinating. Or it's a story that appears to be fascinating by simple merits of it, and then some of my interest can actually get lost in the telling of it. He does not do that. He both has something interesting to tell inherently, and he does a great job at it. And even though this is an autobiography, he also includes a lot of additional information. He does a lot of research to try and tell you what the history of disability is in the United States, as well as, I guess, in the world, broadly speaking. And on top of that, specifically going blind. And I think that he does a fantastic job at getting you very interested and very curious about what are the consequences of developing a disability, and how can it affect your life well beyond the obvious things. I think a big part of this book that I did enjoy, surprisingly, was how much he talks about how it affected his relationship with his wife and his son. He was very open with his wife that he was going blind, but she didn't seem to fully internalize that. And so he talks about how this has been a struggle that both of them didn't fully understand would continue into their relationship. And I found that interesting, but I also found his discussion of Braille, his experience of trying to read Braille, and his history of Braille. I found all of it so interesting that this was one of my favorite memoirs that I've actually ever read. This was, in my opinion, in some cases, barely a memoir, but he did so much additional research, and I didn't feel like there was a manipulative element in the narrative that he was telling. And so I would certainly recommend this if you have any questions about disabilities, or if you're looking for a memoir or a story of perseverance, or just a story of adaptability. This is a great read, and that's why I put this so high on my list. At number 3, we have Continental Reckoning by Elliot West. This one took me a little while to get through because 1, it was pretty long, and 2, it was one of the few that did not have an audiobook, but I really enjoyed it. I didn't know how much I actually enjoyed the history of the American West. I have read a few books here and there. I spent some time in the West. I went to school in Idaho and Utah, and I've enjoyed going out west when I've had the opportunities. I have some family that goes back to the West, particularly Utah, although I didn't visit them growing up. I actually have more association with the Midwest. But I certainly found this an engaging and a fascinating look at a history of the West. It's not some groundbreaking work in terms of trying to present some whole new thesis, but it certainly gave a pretty expansive look at a really defining characteristic of the United States, and that is this idea of westward expansion. And I thought it did a fantastic job at it, and I really enjoyed it. If I were an American historian that was teaching about the West, I would certainly consider finding a way to work this into my syllabus. I think that this, although it's not exactly a major piece of groundbreaking scholarship, I think that it just tells the story of the West in a compelling way. It works in a lot of different narratives, and I can't attest to the quality of writing for all the different narratives, as it is looking at all the different things that cause people to go westward. I can say with my personal familiarity with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that he did an excellent job at characterizing much of their experiences. That's not something that I can always agree with, but I thought that the writing about the Mormon Church was incredibly well done. And that alone was one of the things that made me really enjoy this book. It was only a small part of it, but it was something that gave me confidence that what he was writing about, broadly speaking, was well researched, was well representative of the individuals in which it was talking. And I certainly appreciated that it tried to go well beyond just telling the story of people, but specifically was looking at the consequences of westward expansion, and most notably the consequences on the indigenous population and the Native Americans. And I thought all that just made this an absolutely fascinating read. At number 2, we have Larry McMurtry, A Life by Tracy Dougherty. This is another one of the biography finalists. And I must say, I'm shocked it's so high. This is one of the books that as I was trying to get access to the various books, whether it was an audiobook, ebook, or a physical copy, this was one of the harder ones to get a hold of, and I had to confess that I didn't know how much I'd be interested in it. I wasn't familiar with who Larry McMurtry was. I think I had heard the name. As I looked into him, I certainly recognized some of the works that he was responsible for, and I thought it might be kind of interesting, but I wasn't sure that I would totally buy into his biography. However, after reading it, I would say that I found an immensely interesting character, and I found him so much more important in our understanding of the changing characterizations of the West. I just talked about how I really enjoyed Continental Reckoning, but Larry McMurtry was actually really responsible for giving this much more modern perception of the loneliness of the West, and a more modern understanding of the West that goes well beyond just Manifest Destiny and Pioneers and all that. He deals with this period of the vastness and the loneliness of the West that I think has completely redefined the way that we present the West, and I really, really enjoyed that. I have seen some of his works that he either wrote in a book form or he, in many cases, actually wrote the screenplay for, and I've enjoyed the ones that I am familiar with. But beyond that, I just really appreciated that this book, this author, took an individual that they already knew to be a person of interest and managed to make them interesting to me. And I think that's why it got so high on my list, because I was so fascinated by this individual by the time I was finished with the book. And it's one thing to pick up a biography of someone that I want to know more about. It's another thing to pick up a biography of someone I know nothing about, and by the end of it, to want to know even more about them. And I thought that the author did an excellent job at that. And to me, that is being incredibly successful as an author. And I certainly enjoyed this book, and I would recommend it to anyone that thinks they have any interest whatsoever in the changing landscape of our understanding of our depictions of Western culture. That's why it made it to number 2 on my list, which brings us to number 1. This, of all 18 Pulitzer Prize winners and finalists, this was my favorite, and I think it was actually the first one that I read, and it was King, A Life by Jonathan Eig. I really, really enjoyed this. First of all, I already find Martin Luther King Jr. to be an incredibly important figure in American history, in world history. I think that he represents so much of America that is good, also so much of America that is continuing to struggle. I have always been inspired by Martin Luther King Jr., so I knew that on one level I would enjoy this book. However, I also thought, I've read a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. already. I don't know if you have anything new to bring to the conversation. And I must say that he did, and I appreciated that. But I also appreciated that he gave a total depiction of Martin Luther King Jr. he certainly discussed some of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. has been criticized for in the last couple decades. Well, actually, I think basically since Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, there have been efforts at trying to decrease his political influence and the popular power that he had by criticizing him for a few things, questions about his dissertation and some plagiarism, as well as questions of infidelity and just some of the things that people in power tried to push on him to stop him from being successful. I think that when it comes to Martin Luther King Jr., frequently there's an effort to either write a hagiography of him to present him as a near-perfect individual, or there are these efforts at trying to decrease his political significance by pointing out some of his characteristic flaws or shortcomings. And I think this book does a great job at acknowledging those and dealing with those, but also making sure that you better understand the world in which Martin Luther King Jr. lived and the impact that he had. I will say that it ends somewhat abruptly. I mean, obviously, with Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, that could certainly seem abrupt, but I think that there's still a lot to tell, especially if you consider just how important his legacy is on America. The fact that he has a federal holiday named after him. That came after years and years and lots of effort at trying to express the movement and the ideology that he represented, much more so than any of his individual weaknesses. And so I think that there was room. I mean, I realized trying to write a book about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. would take up volumes, but I did think that it needed just at least like another chapter that talked a little bit more. I mean, I think after he's assassinated, there's like 10, 20 pages left. There's really just not much. And I do think that there was certainly room to write a little bit more after that. However, the author did have access to some of the most recent archival evidence that has been released. And so I think that's why his focus was much more on Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and really did not discuss much of the aftermath of his death. But I certainly would recommend this book to anyone. That is why it was my #1 book for the year. And I find Martin Luther King Jr. to be such an inspirational character, but I also find telling his story gives great insight into a pivotal moment in American history. And for that reason, this was my #1 book of all of the Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners. That's all 18 of them ranked. Please, I would love to know your thoughts on this ranking, on all of these books, whether you have books that you would have preferred had been nominated or won the Pulitzer Prizes, or whether you had a completely different takeaway of what were the best and what were the worst of the books. To be honest, I enjoyed all of them at least to one degree, even if I found some kind of flaws or issues that I had with one or the other. I still think I would recommend almost any of these books to anyone that is interested in a good read. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and until next time, keep those pages turning.